The gray wool of her cheongsam was a poor shield against the biting cold. Lynn's hands, raw and numb, strained against the carved handles of the heavy camphor wood chest. Each push was a battle, the runners of the chest groaning over the frozen ruts of the road. Her father's final words were a phantom echo, sharper than the wind. "You are stupid, a stone, good only for work. He will take you." He had not looked at her when he said it, his gaze fixed on the silver coins the agent had counted onto the table. This was her dowry, a box of her mother's practical things and a one-way ticket to a life sentence in this frozen, empty land. She had pushed the chest for 2 days since the last town, following a crudely drawn map to a place marked only with an X and a name, Frank. Now the sun was a weak smear of orange bleeding into the bruised purple of dusk, and the cold was sinking into her bones. She stumbled, her shoulder slamming into the unyielding wood. This was not a journey. It was a punishment, a shaming. She gritted her teeth, braced her feet, and pushed again. She would not die on this road. That was the vow she made in the silent world of her mind. She would not give her father the satisfaction. A shadow fell over her. Lynn felt the vibration through the soles of her worn slippers before she saw the man. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with a face weathered by the elements into a mask of grim patience. He stood a few feet away, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. He spoke, his mouth forming words she could not catch, the sounds lost to the deafness that had been her lifelong cage. She simply stared back, her breath pluming in the frigid air, her hands still gripping the chest as if it were the only solid thing in the universe. He took a step closer, gesturing to the chest, then to the vast, empty landscape around them. He was asking a question. She knew the shape of it. "What are you doing here?" She reached into the sleeve of her dress and pulled out a folded, oilskin-wrapped paper. It was the letter, the bill of sale. She held it out to him, her arm trembling not from cold, but from a profound, final humiliation. This was the moment of her delivery. This was the moment she became property. He took the paper, his calloused fingers brushing hers. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, met hers for a moment before dropping to read the document that defined her entire existence. He unfolded it slowly, the crinkle of the paper loud in the immense quiet of the coming night. The man, Frank, read the letter under the weak light of the lantern in his cabin. The ink was stark against the cheap paper, the words blunt and cruel. "This is my daughter, Lynn. She is 18 years of age, strong. She is stupid in the head, deaf as a post, good only for work. She is now yours. Payment received." He read it twice, a muscle jerking in his jaw. The casual brutality of it settled like a stone in his gut. He looked over at the girl who sat rigidly on a small stool by the cold hearth, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floorboards. She hadn't moved since he'd half-carried, half-dragged her chest inside. She looked less like a bride and more like a prisoner awaiting a verdict. He felt a surge of anger, not at her, but at the man who would write such a thing about his own child. He tossed the letter onto the rough-hewn table. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice louder than he intended. She didn't flinch, didn't look up. Of course, deaf as a post. He knelt in front of her, waiting until her dark eyes lifted to meet his. He pointed to his ear, then shook his head, forming a question with his expression. She gave a single, sharp nod. The confirmation sent another wave of fury through him. He wasn't a cruel man, but he was a practical one. He had paid for a wife, a partner to help tame this harsh, lonely land. He had not paid for a burden. Yet, looking at her, seeing the defiant set of her jaw beneath the fear, he couldn't bring himself to send her back. Back to what? A father who called her stupid? He stood up and walked to a small slate board hanging by the wall. He picked up a piece of chalk. "Can you read?" he wrote, and held it up. She watched his hands, then her eyes focused on the words. She nodded again, a flicker of something, relief, in her expression. This was a language they could share. He wiped the slate clean. "The letter says you are here to be my wife." He watched her face. She read the words and a shudder came down over her eyes, her expression becoming perfectly, terrifyingly blank. She looked at him, then at the rough interior of the cabin, at the single cot in the corner, and finally back at him. She gave another slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't acceptance, it was resignation. Frank felt a deep, unwelcome shame. This was wrong. All of it. He erased the words with the heel of his hand. "This was not the agreement," he wrote. "I needed a partner, not this." He couldn't write the word slave. 4 months, he wrote, the chalk scratching loudly in the quiet room. "You stay 4 months, until the spring thaw. You work. You prove you are not a burden. If you can do that, you can stay. If not, I will send you back to the city. Understood?" He held up the slate. She read the words carefully, her eyes tracing each letter. 4 months. A trial. A chance. It was more than her father had ever given her. It was a reprieve. Her gaze lifted from the slate to his face, searching for deception. She saw none, only a weary sort of honor. For the first time since leaving home, a tiny, fragile seed of hope took root in the frozen ground of her heart. She nodded. The ranch was not a home. It was a fortress against the wilderness. A small, sturdy cabin, a solid barn, and a collection of corrals stood like a fist clenched against the endless, snow-dusted plains. Lynn's world shrank to the rhythm of survival. Frank was a man of few words, which suited her silence. He communicated through gestures, notes on the slate, and a surprising patience. The real test came from the other two inhabitants of the ranch, Gus and Pete. Gus was the older hand, his face a road map of hard winters, his eyes narrowed with permanent skepticism. Pete was younger, quieter, always watching from the periphery. From their first morning, Gus made his disdain clear. He'd issue a string of rapid-fire orders, watch her stand motionless, then throw his hands up in theatrical frustration. "See, Frank? Stone deaf. Useless." Frank would intervene, demonstrating the task himself, mucking out the stalls, portioning the feed, checking the water troughs for ice. Lynn learned by watching. Her world became a tapestry of visual cues, the way Frank's shoulders tensed when a storm was coming, the specific way Gus tested the harness leather for cracks, the faint tremor in the ground that signaled the horses were restless. She could not hear the world, so she learned to see it with an intensity the others couldn't comprehend. Her first weeks were a series of small, sharp humiliations. Gus would forget she was behind him and back into her, sending a bucket of feed spilling into the mud. Pete would try to speak to her, his face contorting with pity when she didn't respond, which felt even worse. They saw her deafness first. They saw the stupid her father had written about. They did not see her. She retreated into the work. Her hands, once soft, became chapped and strong. She learned the weight of a full pail of water, the smell of clean hay, the satisfying ache in her muscles at the end of a 16-hour day. She organized the pantry, arranging the sacks of flour and beans with a meticulous logic that made finding anything twice as fast. She took over the mending, her stitches small and neat, reinforcing worn seams on their canvas coats until they were stronger than new. They were small things, but they were hers. They were her answer to their doubt. One afternoon, Gus was trying to fix a broken latch on the chicken coop. cursing under his breath as he fumbled with the metal pieces. Lynn watched him for a moment, then walked over, took the pieces from his surprised grasp, and examined them. She saw the problem instantly, a bent pin that wouldn't align. She picked up a small rock, found a flat stone for an anvil, and with a few precise taps, straightened the pin perfectly. She handed the pieces back to him. He stared at the pin, then at her, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. He fitted the latch together. It clicked shut smoothly. He didn't say thank you, but the next morning he left a cup of hot brewed coffee on the edge of the stove for her, a silent admission that was louder than any word he could have spoken. Her competence became a quiet language of its own. It wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the steady accumulation of small, undeniable proofs. She noticed things. While mucking out the sheep pen, she saw that one of the ewes was favoring its leg, a tiny limp no one else had caught. She pointed it out to Frank, who examined the animal and found a deep thorn lodged in its hoof, an injury that could have turned septic. He cleaned and dressed the wound, his movements efficient, but he glanced at Lynn afterward with a new look in his eyes. It wasn't pity, it was a sliver of respect. She learned to anticipate needs before they were voiced. When the temperature plunged, she spent an evening stuffing rags into the cracks in the barn walls, a tedious, finger-numbing job. Gus came in the next morning, grumbling about the cold, and stopped, his breath fogging in the air. The barn was noticeably warmer, the animals calmer. He looked at the sealed cracks, then over at Lynn, who was already forking hay into the mangers. He just shook his head and got to work, the complaint dying on his lips. The men had their routines, hardened over years of shared labor, but Lynn saw the inefficiencies. The tools were kept in a jumble in a corner of the barn. She spent a whole afternoon sorting them, cleaning them of rust, and hanging them on pegs she hammered into the wall, arranged by function. When Pete went to fetch a wrench, he stopped in his tracks, staring at the organized display. "Well, I'll be," he muttered to himself, pulling the tool from its hook without having to dig through a pile of metal. She was demonstrating her value not through speech, but through action. Her father had called her a stone, but a stone could be a foundation. It could be steady and reliable. She was proving she was not a fragile thing to be managed, but a capable part of the ranch's machinery. Her silence, once a mark of her deficiency, became a source of focus. While the men might be distracted by conversation or banter, she was always watching, always processing the physical reality of their world. She was the first to see the telltale signs of a fox near the hen house, the first to notice the water barrel was running low, the first to feel the shift in the air that meant a blizzard was only hours away. The slate board was used less for instructions and more for conversation. One evening, Frank wrote, "How did you learn to mend so well?" Lynn took the chalk. "My mother. She said hands that can make and mend will never be empty." It was the first time she had shared anything personal. Frank nodded slowly, a quiet understanding passing between them. He was beginning to see the person behind the label her father had created. He was seeing Lynn. The trust between them was not built on grand confessions, but on small, quiet acts of care. One evening, a bitter cold snap settled over the plains, aggravating an old injury in Frank's leg. He tried to hide the limp, but Lynn saw the way he favored it, the tight line of pain around his mouth. He said nothing, too proud to admit the weakness. While he was out for the final check on the animals, she heated water on the stove, soaked a thick cloth in it, and wrapped it in a piece of canvas. When he came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, she simply walked over and held it out to him. He looked from the steaming bundle to her face, startled. His first instinct was to refuse, to wave it away. But her expression was not one of pity. It was matter of fact, a simple, practical offering. He hesitated, then took it, the warmth a shocking relief against his aching knee. "Thank you," he said, the words spoken aloud before he remembered she couldn't hear them. He met her eyes and nodded his gratitude instead. A silent contract was being rewritten between them, one of mutual support, not just labor. A few nights later, a storm raged outside, rattling the very bones of the cabin. The noise was irrelevant to Lynn, but she could feel the vibration of the wind's fury. Frank sat by the fire cleaning a piece of tack. He seemed troubled. He finally picked up the slate. "That chest you brought, it's very fine wood. Must have been difficult to push." She watched him write, then took the chalk from his hand. "It was my mother's," she wrote. "It is all I have of her." He looked at the chest, which sat against the far wall like a silent sentinel. "May I ask what is inside?" The question was gentle, a request, not a demand. She paused for a long moment. No one had ever asked about her world, only what she could do for theirs. She stood, walked to the chest, and lifted the heavy lid. The scent of camphor and dried lavender filled the small room. It was not filled with silks or fine dresses. Instead, it was packed with the tools of a life. Tightly bound bundles of rare seeds her mother had collected, spools of strong thread and sharp needles, a well-cared-for set of gardening tools, and tucked in a corner, wrapped in a piece of silk, was a small, smooth jade pendant carved in the shape of a simple leaf. It was cool and solid in her palm. She held it out for him to see. He looked at the practical, life-affirming contents, then at the single, beautiful object. He understood. This was not a bride's trousseau. It was a survival kit, a legacy of resilience passed from a mother to her daughter. He looked at the pendant, then back at Lynn's face, seeing the echo of her mother's strength there. "She must have been a very wise woman," he wrote on the slate. Lynn's eyes welled with tears, the first she had allowed herself to shed in this cold, hard place. She nodded, clutching the pendant tight. He had seen her mother, not as a memory, but as a person, and in doing so, he had truly seen her, too. The fragile peace of their growing routine was shattered by the arrival of a man on a fine black horse. He rode as if he owned the land, his coat expensive, his posture radiating an arrogant entitlement. He introduced himself as Mr. Davies, their neighbor to the east. His smile didn't reach his cold, assessing eyes. He ignored Lynn completely at first, his focus entirely on Frank. "Still scratching out a living on this rock pile, are we?" Davies asked, his voice smooth and condescending. Frank's face hardened. "We do all right, Davies." Davies' gaze finally slid over to Lynn, who was standing near the doorway. He looked her up and down with an insulting slowness. "I see you've acquired some company. A new mail-order trinket to brighten up the place?" The word trinket was a deliberate sting. It reduced her to an object, a decoration. Lynn, reading his lips, felt a cold fury rise within her. She met his gaze directly, her expression unyielding. Her refusal to be intimidated seemed to annoy him. He turned back to Frank, his tone shifting from mockery to menace. "You know why I'm here. That note is coming due. I want those water rights. That creek is worth more than this entire pathetic ranch, and you and I both know it." Frank stood his ground. "The note's not due for another month. You'll get your money." "See that I do," Davies said, his smile turning predatory. "Because I have plans for this valley, and they don't include you, or your curiosities." He flicked his gaze back to Lynn, a clear threat embedded in the words. He mounted his horse, wheeled the animal around, and galloped away, leaving a tense silence in his wake. The encounter left a poison in the air. The unspoken arrangement between Lynn and Frank, the 4-month trial, suddenly felt flimsy against the weight of this new external threat. Later that day, Frank found her sharpening an axe blade, her movements precise and forceful. He stood watching her for a moment. "Davies is a dangerous man," he wrote on the slate. "He wants this land. He will look for any weakness." Lynn stopped her work, wiping her hands on a rag. She took the chalk. "I am not a weakness," she wrote. The words were not a question, but a declaration. It was a promise. She was no one's trinket. She was not a curiosity, and she would not be the reason Frank lost his home. The stakes had been raised. This was no longer just about her survival. It was about theirs. Davies was not a man to wait. The attack came a week later, during the disorienting chaos of a sudden, violent blizzard. The snow came down in a blinding sheet, erasing the world, muffling all sound for those who could hear. For Lynn, the world simply went white, the vibrations of the storm a low hum through the cabin floor. She was awake, unable to sleep, when she felt a different vibration, a frantic, rhythmic thudding from the direction of the sheep pen. It was wrong. It was the panicked beat of terror. She grabbed a lantern and, pulling a heavy coat over her shoulders, plunged into the storm. The wind tore at her, but she followed the feeling, the disturbance in the earth. As she neared the pen, she saw them, two figures, bulky in the swirling snow, driving the small flock of sheep out through a cut section of the fence, trying to stampede them into the open plains where they would surely freeze or be lost. They were Davies' men. There was no time to get frank. Lynn didn't hesitate. She was not a fighter, but she knew the land. She knew its secrets. She ran to the barn, her mind racing. She grabbed 2 empty tin buckets and a mallet. Scrambling up the ladder to the hayloft, she kicked open the loft door that overlooked the path the men were taking. As they passed below, she began beating the buckets together with the mallet. To her, the noise was just a dull thudding in her hands, but she knew the sharp metallic clang would be deafeningly loud, disorienting in the muffled quiet of the snowstorm. The men below swore, startled, looking around wildly for the source of the racket. The sheep, already panicked, scattered in the opposite direction, back toward the relative safety of the barn. One of the men saw her silhouette in the hayloft door and raised his arm. Something whistled past her head. He had thrown a rock. But the diversion had worked. Lights flared in the cabin as Frank, Gus, and Pete, roused by the commotion, burst outside. Frank took in the scene in an instant. The cut fence, the scattered sheep, Lynn in the hayloft. He and the others charged forward, their presence enough to send the 2 saboteurs scrambling into the darkness. They vanished into the blizzard as quickly as they had appeared. The immediate danger was over. They spent the next hour rounding up the terrified sheep and herding them into the barn, their breath coming in ragged clouds. When the last one was safely inside, Frank looked for Lynn. He found her quietly mending the cut fence with wire and spare boards, her face illuminated by the lantern, the snow dusting her dark hair. He walked over to her, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and awe. He put a hand on her shoulder. She looked up, her face calm. In that moment, he saw her not as a deaf girl, not as a mail-order bride, but as a warrior who had defended his home. Gus came up beside him, looking from the mended fence to Lynn. He cleared his throat. "She's got grit, Frank," he said, the highest praise he was capable of giving. "More than most." The aftermath of the attack solidified Lynn's place on the ranch. She was no longer the outsider on trial. She was a defender, one of them. The camaraderie in the small cabin shifted. Gus now saved her the best pieces of jerky. Pete started trying to learn a few rudimentary hand signs he'd seen in a book once, his clumsy attempts making her smile. They were a unit, forged in the crucible of the blizzard, but their victory was a fragile thing. 2 days later, the sheriff rode in, and he was not alone. Mr. Davies sat beside him on his black horse, a smug, triumphant look on his face. "Frank," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with reluctance, "Mr. Davies here has filed a formal complaint. He's calling in your note." Frank's face went pale. "The note isn't due for 3 more weeks." "I bought the debt from the bank this morning," Davies said smoothly, dismounting. "The terms of my purchase allow me to call it in with 48 hours' notice. It's all perfectly legal." He produced a sheaf of papers, a contract heavy with fine print and official seals. "You have 2 days to produce the full amount, $500. If you can't, the property and all its assets, including the water rights, revert to me as collateral." It was a death sentence. $500 was an impossible sum, especially in the dead of winter. It was a checkmate, delivered with the cold, impartial force of the law. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "My hands are tied, Frank. It's a legal contract." Davies' eyes swept over the ranch, a conqueror already claiming his prize. His gaze landed on Lynn, who stood watching, reading the grim finality on their faces. "You'll all be off this land by the end of the week," Davies sneered. "And I'll make sure she," he jerked his chin at Lynn, "is put on the first transport back to whatever gutter she crawled out of." The threat was personal, designed to twist the knife. Frank took a step forward, his fists clenched, but Gus put a hand on his arm. Violence would only make it worse. The law was on Davies' side. The institutional pressure was absolute. They were trapped. That night, the cabin was suffocating with despair. Frank sat at the table, his head in his hands. "It's over," he said, his voice hollow. "There's no way. He's won." He looked up at Lynn, his face etched with defeat. "You should pack your chest. I can give you the last of the money. It'll get you to the city. You'll be safer there." He was trying to protect her, to give her an escape, but Lynn shook her head. She would not run. This was her home now. Her eyes fell on the contract Davies had contemptuously tossed on the table. It was the weapon he had used to destroy them. She walked over to the table and picked up the contract. The men watched her, confused. What could she possibly do? She couldn't read the complex legal jargon, but she didn't need to. Her father, for all his cruelty, had been a surveyor's assistant before he became a merchant. He had taught her one thing of value: how to read maps, how to understand the language of lines and boundaries, a language that required no hearing. The contract was thick, but attached to the back, folded neatly, was a survey map of the properties, detailing the boundary lines and the creek that was the source of their conflict. She spread it flat on the table, smoothing the creases with her palm. The men gathered around, watching. Frank assumed she was just looking at it, a futile gesture of defiance. But Lynn was seeing something else. Her finger traced the line that marked the edge of Frank's property. Then it traced the line marking Davies' land. Between them, following the winding path of the creek, was a thin, unclaimed sliver of territory. A discrepancy in the original survey, no more than 20 feet wide, but critically, it contained the wellhead and the primary access point to the water. Her father had told her about such things, surveying errors from the early days that left small pockets of land technically ownerless, belonging only to the state until formally claimed. She looked up at Frank, her eyes wide with discovery. She tapped the map, pointing to the sliver of land. Then she pointed to the well outside the window. She tapped the section marked Frank's property and shook her head. Then she tapped the section marked Davies' property and shook her head again. Frank stared, not understanding. "What is it, Lynn?" Gus leaned closer, squinting at the map. "Wait a minute." He followed her finger. That's not right. The creek access. According to this map, it ain't on your land, Frank. It's not on his either." A slow, dawning realization spread across Frank's face. He snatched the map, holding it closer to the lantern light. It was true. The very thing Davies was using a $500 debt to seize, the water rights, was located on a piece of land that neither of them actually owned. Davies' entire scheme was built on a foundation of fraud. He was trying to foreclose on an asset Frank didn't possess, hoping no one would ever check the fine print of his own doctored map. The stupid girl, the one who lived in a world of silence and observation, had seen the detail everyone else had missed. She had found the flaw in their enemy's weapon. She had found their hope. The next morning, they did not wait for Davies to come to them. Frank, with Lynn by his side and the contract in his hand, rode to the sheriff's office. Gus and Pete stayed behind, their orders to stand guard. The sheriff was surprised to see them, his expression weary. "Frank, there's nothing I can do." "Maybe there is," Frank said, his voice steady and clear. He unrolled the map from the contract and spread it across the sheriff's desk. Lynn stood beside him, a silent, powerful presence. "This is the map from Davies' own paperwork. Have a look at the survey lines along the creek." The sheriff leaned in, tracing the boundaries with a skeptical finger. His eyebrows slowly rose. "Well, I'll be damned." At that moment, the door opened and Mr. Davies strode in, a smug smile on his face. "Come to hand over the deed, have you? I knew you were a sensible man." His smile vanished when he saw the map on the desk and the look on the sheriff's face. "What is this?" "This," the sheriff said, his voice now cold and hard, "is fraud." He tapped the map. "You're attempting to seize an asset that isn't part of the collateral. The water access point isn't on Frank's land. According to your own survey, it's on unclaimed territory." Davies' face went from smug to purple with rage. "That's a clerical error, a mistake. The intent of the agreement is clear." "The law cares about what's on the paper, Davies," the sheriff replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And this paper says you tried to swindle a man for something he doesn't even own. The debt may be real, but this foreclosure is invalid. Get out of my office." Davies stared, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He shot a look of pure venom at Frank, and then at Lynn, the source of his humiliation. He knew, somehow, that she was the one who had undone him. He turned and stormed out, defeated. In the quiet office, Frank looked at Lynn. The weight of the past months, the fear and the uncertainty, finally lifted. He owed her everything. Not just his home, but his hope. He reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her with such open tenderness. Later, back at the ranch, he took the original letter from her father, the one that called her stupid and deaf, and tore it into small pieces. Then he dropped them into the fire and watched them burn. He turned to Lynn, the slate in his hand. "This is your home now," he wrote, "if you choose it." Lynn took the chalk from him. She didn't write a word. Instead, she reached out and gently took his hand in hers. Her choice was made. The spring thaw came weeks later, turning the frozen land to soft, fertile earth. The 4-month trial was long over, forgotten. Lynn planted the seeds from her mother's chest in a small garden by the cabin. Months later, as the sun set in a blaze of glory over the valley, Frank and Lynn stood together, watching the green shoots push their way toward the sky. Years passed. The small ranch thrived. They bought the unclaimed sliver of land from the state, securing their water and their future. The cabin was expanded, the herds grew, and the place that was once a fortress against loneliness became a beacon of warmth and life. Gus and Pete stayed on, becoming less like hands and more like family. Frank and Lynn's partnership, born of desperation and built on silent understanding, deepened into a love as solid and enduring as the land itself. She was never his property. He was never her master. They were simply two people who had found each other in the wilderness and built a world together. Her father had sent her away as a stone, meant to be a burden. But he was wrong. She was a cornerstone, and on her they had built everything.